Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight, we bring you 7 deeply disturbing, true Pacific Northwest horror stories that will make you question what really lurks in the misty forests and isolated coastlines of America's most enigmatic region. These are not works of fiction, but documented accounts gathered from individuals who experience the inexplicable in places where the boundary between civilization and wilderness remains dangerously thin. Each story has been compiled from first-hand testimonies, historical records, and investigative research that reveal the darker side of this beautiful but unforgiving landscape. The Pacific Northwest has always harbored mysteries that defy rational explanation. And perhaps some truths are better left buried in the depths of those ancient woods and cold waters. If you appreciate genuine horror content rooted in reality that will stay with you long after the video ends, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the unexplained phenomena that most people refuse to acknowledge. After experiencing these 7 chilling encounters, we invite you to share your own Pacific Northwest experiences or thoughts in the comment section below. Now settle in and prepare yourself as we uncover the darkness that dwells in the shadows of the evergreen forests and fog-shrouded shores. Harold Whitmore had dedicated 23 years of his life to the North Cascades National Park when October of 1987 arrived with an unusual chill that seemed to settle deep into the ancient rock formations. He was not a man prone to superstition or flights of fancy. His career had been built on practical knowledge of wilderness survival, meticulous attention to weather patterns, and an unwavering commitment to the safety of every visitor who passed through the park's entrance. Harold had conducted dozens of search and rescue operations over the years, pulling injured hikers from treacherous slopes and guiding lost tourists back to civilization. He thought he had seen everything the mountains could throw at him. He was wrong. The call came through on a Friday afternoon, shortly after 3 o'clock. Harold was finishing paperwork at the ranger station when dispatch informed him that a family had failed to return from what was supposed to be a simple day hike along the Cascade Pass Trail. The Hendersons, Robert, age 42, his wife Patricia, age 39, and their daughter Jennifer, age 16, had checked in with the station early that morning. Robert Henderson had seemed particularly enthusiastic about the hike, telling Harold they were celebrating Jennifer's birthday with a weekend camping trip. They planned to hike to Cascade Pass, take some photographs, and return to their campsite at Pelton Basin by sunset. When they had not returned by nightfall, and their empty tent remained undisturbed at the campground, the camp host had grown concerned enough to notify park authorities. Harold assembled a search team immediately. The weather forecast was troubling. A rare early-season storm system was moving in from the Pacific, bringing with it the threat of snow at higher elevations. The temperature had already dropped 15 degrees since morning, and thick clouds were gathering over the mountain peaks like a gray shroud being drawn across the sky. Harold knew that if the Hendersons were injured or lost somewhere on that trail, they would be facing a dangerous night in conditions that could turn deadly very quickly. He gathered 5 experienced rangers, equipped them with emergency medical supplies, high-powered flashlights, and radio equipment, then led them up the trail as the last light of day began to fade from the western sky. The Cascade Pass Trail was one of the most popular hiking routes in the North Cascades, a 7.5-mile round trip that gained 2,800 feet in elevation. The trail wound through dense old-growth forest before emerging above the tree line into alpine meadows that offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. Harold had hiked this trail hundreds of times, He knew every switchback, every rocky outcrop, every stream crossing. As the search team made their way up the darkening trail, calling out the Henderson family's names, Harold felt an unusual sense of unease that he could not quite explain. The forest seemed too quiet. The usual sounds of birds settling into their evening roosts were absent. Even the wind moving through the trees had a hollow, mournful quality that set his nerves on edge. They searched through the night, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like pale fingers reaching into shadow. The temperature continued to drop. By midnight, Harold's breath was forming clouds of vapor in the frigid air, and a light snow had begun to fall. The fresh powder covered the trail, obscuring any footprints the Hendersons might have left behind. Harold divided his team into pairs, assigning each pair a section of the trail to search thoroughly while maintaining radio contact. He took the upper section himself, climbing toward Cascade Pass as the snow fell more heavily around him. The beam of his flashlight illuminated millions of swirling snowflakes, creating a disorienting effect that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. It was nearly 3 in the morning when one of the search teams radioed Harold with news. They had found something near the 4-mile marker, a day pack, partially hidden beneath an overhanging rock. Harold hurried down the trail to their location, hope surging in his chest. Perhaps the Hendersons had taken shelter somewhere nearby. Perhaps they had simply gotten turned around in the growing darkness and were waiting out the night until conditions improved. When Harold reached the location and examined the day pack with his flashlight, his hope began to curdle into something else. The pack was a blue Eddie Bauer model, relatively new, and contained items that clearly belonged to the Henderson family. There was a wallet with Robert Henderson's driver's license and credit cards. There were granola bars and a half-empty water bottle. Most significantly, there was a camera, a Canon AE-1 35mm with a telephoto lens. What disturbed Harold was not what the pack contained, but where it had been found. The pack was sitting upright against the rock face, carefully positioned as though someone had deliberately placed it there. It had not been dropped or abandoned in haste. The zipper was closed. The items inside were neatly organized. It looked like someone had wanted the pack to be found, had positioned it specifically to catch the attention of anyone searching this area. Harold felt his skin prickle despite the cold. He carefully removed the camera from the pack and examined it. The film counter indicated that 23 of the 36 exposures had been used. Whatever had happened to the Henderson family might be documented on that roll of film. The search continued through Saturday and into Sunday. The storm intensified, dumping 8 inches of snow on the higher elevations and forcing Harold to call in additional personnel and equipment. A helicopter was dispatched from the nearest Coast Guard station, equipped with thermal imaging cameras to scan the mountainside for any sign of body heat. Trained search dogs were brought in to track the family's scent from their abandoned campsite. The local media picked up the story, and soon Harold found himself coordinating not just a search and rescue operation, but managing the dozens of volunteers who showed up wanting to help find the missing family. The Hendersons' relatives arrived from Seattle, desperate and terrified, pleading with Harold to do everything possible to bring their loved ones home. On the 3rd day of searching, a dog handler made a discovery that turned Harold's stomach. Near the edge of a steep cliff face, approximately half a mile past where the backpack had been found, the dogs located several items that had clearly belonged to the Henderson family. There was a red fleece jacket that Patricia Henderson had been wearing, according to her sister's description. there was a baseball cap with a Seattle Mariners logo that had belonged to Robert. Most disturbing of all, there was Jennifer's birthday necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small heart pendant that her parents had given her that morning. The items were scattered near the cliff edge, as though they had been deliberately removed and left behind. The cliff dropped away into a rocky gorge nearly 200 feet below, where a narrow stream cut through boulders covered in moss and ice. Harold organized a technical rescue team to rappel down into the gorge. If the Hendersons had fallen from the cliff, their bodies would be somewhere in that rocky maze below. The rappel team spent hours searching every crevice and hollow, but they found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no indication that anyone had fallen or been injured in that location. It was as though the Henderson family had simply removed their belongings, left them at the cliff edge, and vanished into thin air. Harold had never encountered anything like this in his entire career. People did not just disappear without leaving some trace, some evidence of what had happened to them. The film from the camera was developed on Monday morning at a photo lab in nearby Marble Mount. Harold sat in a small room at the ranger station, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand, as he slowly went through the stack of photographs, one by one. The first images showed exactly what he expected to see. The Hendersons had documented their drive to the park, their arrival at the campground, Jennifer smiling and holding up a birthday cake decorated with 16 candles. There were photos of the trail itself, the morning sun filtering through the tall Douglas firs, Patricia pointing at a patch of wildflowers that had somehow survived into the late season. Robert had photographed a deer they had encountered near the 2-mile marker. Jennifer had taken several selfies with the mountain peaks visible in the background. Then, the photographs changed. Image number 14 showed the family stopped on the trail, posing together with their arms around each other. Behind them, barely visible between 2 large cedar trees, was the shape of a person. The figure was too far away and too obscured by shadow to make out any details. But Harold could clearly see that someone had been watching the Henderson family from the forest. He felt his pulse quicken as he moved to the next photograph. Image 15 showed Patricia and Jennifer together, both smiling at the camera while Robert presumably took the shot. The figure in the background had moved closer. It was now standing at the edge of the trail, perhaps 50 feet behind the 2 women. Still too distant to see clearly, but definitely human in shape, wearing what appeared to be dark clothing. Harold's hands were shaking slightly as he continued through the photographs. With each image, the mysterious figure drew nearer to the Henderson family. In photo 18, the figure was only about 30 feet behind them, though they still seemed completely unaware of being followed. Harold could make out more details now. The person was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes that seemed wrong for the season and the terrain. There was something about the figure's posture that struck Harold as off, unnatural, like someone moving in a way that human joints were not meant to move. In photo 20, the figure had closed the distance to perhaps 15 feet. Robert had taken a picture of Jennifer pointing at something off the trail, her face bright with excitement. The figure stood directly in the center of the frame behind her, closer now than seemed possible given the timing between shots. Then Harold reached photograph number 23, the final image on the roll, and his blood ran cold. This photo showed all 3 members of the Henderson family posing together. Someone else must have taken this picture. Someone who had offered to capture a family moment on their daughter's 16th birthday. They were standing close together, smiling at the camera with the beautiful alpine landscape spread out behind them. And standing directly behind the family, close enough to reach out and touch them, was the figure that had been following them through the forest. For the first time, Harold could see the face clearly. Except there was no face. Where the figure's head should have been was only a smooth, featureless expanse of what looked like pale leather stretched tight over bone. The figure's impossibly long arms hung at its sides, fingers extending down past where its knees should be. It was standing so close to the Henderson family that its shadow should have been falling across them. Yet, in the photograph, there was no shadow. The thing cast no darkness of its own. Harold stood up from his chair so quickly that he knocked his coffee cup to the floor, where it shattered into pieces that spread across the linoleum like broken teeth. He walked to the window and stared out at the mountains, trying to steady his breathing, trying to process what he had just seen. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps the image was a trick of light and shadow, a photographic artifact, double exposure from a camera malfunction. But Harold had been looking at wilderness photographs for more than 2 decades. He knew what camera errors looked like. What he had just seen was not an error. Something had been following the Henderson family up that trail. Something had gotten close enough to stand directly behind them while someone took their final photograph. And that something had led them to the cliff edge, where their belongings were found, scattered across the rocks. The investigation continued for 3 more weeks. Federal authorities were brought in. The FBI opened a missing persons case. Search teams combed through hundreds of square miles of wilderness, checking every trail, every cave, every possible location where 3 people might have taken shelter or met with an accident. They found nothing. Robert, Patricia, and Jennifer Henderson had vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. The case eventually went cold, filed away in a cabinet full of other mysteries that the mountains refused to explain. The official conclusion was that the family had likely fallen from the cliff, and their bodies had been carried away by the stream or covered by rockfall in the gorge below. Harold knew this conclusion was false, but he had no evidence to support an alternative theory. He could not very well tell his superiors that he believed the Henderson family had been taken by something that should not exist, something that appeared in photographs with no face and cast no shadow. Harold requested and was granted a transfer to Olympic National Park the following spring. He could not continue working in the North Cascades, not after what he had seen in those photographs. For years afterward, he would wake in the night from dreams of that faceless figure standing in the forest, its impossibly long fingers reaching toward him through the darkness. He kept copies of the photographs locked in a safe deposit box at his bank, unable to destroy them, but equally unable to look at them again. The original prints and negatives were sealed in an evidence locker somewhere in Seattle, forgotten by everyone except Harold himself. On his final day working at the North Cascades Ranger Station, Harold drove up to Cascade Pass one last time. It was early morning, and the summer sun was just beginning to illuminate the high peaks. He stood at the trailhead where the Henderson family had begun their hike 7 months earlier, looking up at the trail as it wound its way through the forest toward the alpine meadows above. Harold thought about Robert Henderson's enthusiasm that October morning, about the birthday cake with 16 candles, about Jennifer's silver necklace lying on the rocks at the cliff edge. He thought about the camera's final image and the thing that had followed them through the trees as Harold turned to walk back to his truck. Movement at the edge of the forest caught his eye. For just a moment, barely a heartbeat, he saw a tall, thin figure standing between two cedar trees, exactly where it had been in photograph number 14. The figure was watching him with a face that had no features, no eyes, no mouth, nothing but smooth, pale skin stretched over bone. Then Harold blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving behind only shadows and the whisper of wind through the branches. Harold got into his truck and drove away from the North Cascades for the last time. He never returned to that place, and he never spoke publicly about what he had seen in those photographs or what he had witnessed at the trailhead on his final morning. The Henderson family remains missing to this day. 3 names on a long list of people who walked into the wilderness and never came back. Search and rescue teams still operate in the North Cascades, still patrol the trails, still respond when hikers fail to return from the mountains. But Harold knows, even if no one else does, that some disappearances cannot be explained by bad weather or poor planning or simple misfortune. Sometimes people vanish because something in those ancient forests decides to take them. Sometimes the mountains claim what they want, and no amount of searching will ever bring those people home. The photographs remain locked away in Harold's safe deposit box, rarely seen and never shown. On quiet nights, when sleep will not come, Harold sometimes thinks about that final image of the Henderson family smiling together, with the faceless figure standing behind them. He wonders if they ever saw what was following them. He wonders if they had any warning at all before the end came. Most of all, he wonders how many other families have posed for similar photographs in similar places, completely unaware of what stands behind them in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reach out with those impossibly long fingers and pull them into a darkness from which there is no return. Mabel Crawford had worked as a night shift caretaker at the Paradise Inn on Mount Rainier for 15 years before she first encountered what the local indigenous tribes called the Keeper. She was 63 years old, a widow with grown children who had long since moved away to cities where opportunity seemed more plentiful than in the isolated mountain communities of Washington state. Mabel had taken the caretaker position not out of necessity, but out of preference. She enjoyed the solitude of winter nights when the Grand Lodge stood empty and silent, when the only sounds were the settling of old timber and the wind moving across the snowfields outside. She had never been afraid of being alone. That would change. The Paradise Inn was a magnificent structure built in 1916, constructed from massive cedar logs and local stone, designed to accommodate the wealthy tourists who came to experience the majesty of Mount Rainier during the summer months. The building sat at 5,400 feet of elevation, surrounded by alpine meadows that exploded with wildflowers in July and August, but lay buried beneath 30 feet of snow during the long winters. The inn closed to guests each year in October and did not reopen until late May, leaving a 7-month period when the building required minimal maintenance and security. That was where Mabel came in. She lived in a small apartment in the inn's service wing, making her rounds through the empty corridors 3 times each night, checking for burst pipes, monitoring the heating system, ensuring that the structure weathered the harsh mountain winters without suffering damage that would be expensive to repair come spring. Mabel had grown accustomed to the creaks and groans that old buildings make, especially during winter when temperatures plunged well below zero and ice formed thick layers on the windows. She knew which floorboards squeaked, which doors swung open if not properly latched, which sections of the building were colder than others due to the vagaries of the heating system. She could navigate the entire inn in darkness if necessary. Though she always carried a heavy flashlight during her rounds, its beam cutting through the shadows as she moved from room to room, floor to floor, checking off items on her nightly inspection list. The work was not difficult, merely monotonous, and Mabel found a certain comfort in the predictable routine. It was during the third week of February in 1994 that the routine shattered. A massive winter storm had moved in from the Pacific Ocean, bringing with it winds that howled across the mountain like the voices of angry spirits. Snow fell so thickly that Mabel could not see more than a few feet beyond the windows. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees below zero, and the entire structure groaned under the assault of wind that seemed determined to tear the building from its foundation. Mabel had weathered many storms during her years at the Paradise Inn, but this one felt different. There was a quality to the wind that reminded her of screaming, and the darkness beyond the windows seemed to press against the glass, as though it were a living thing trying to force its way inside. Mabel began her midnight rounds as usual, starting from her apartment and working her way through the service areas before moving into the main lodge. The grand lobby was a cavernous space, 3 stories tall, with massive log beams supporting the ceiling and a stone fireplace large enough to walk inside. During the summer months, this space would be filled with guests, with laughter and conversation and the warm glow of firelight. Now it stood empty and cold, her flashlight beams seeming small and inadequate as it swept across the expanse of shadow. Mabel checked the main doors, confirmed they were securely locked, then moved toward the staircase that led to the guest room corridors on the upper floors. That was when she heard the footsteps. They came from directly above her head, a slow, measured pace moving across the ceiling of the lobby. Mabel stopped walking and tilted her head upward, listening carefully. The footsteps continued, moving from the east side of the building toward the west, following the path of the second-floor corridor. Mabel felt her heartbeat quicken. There should be no one else in the building. The road to paradise was closed, had been closed for months, buried beneath snow that would not be cleared until April at the earliest. The only way to reach the inn during winter was by snowshoe or cross-country skis, a journey of several miles through treacherous terrain. No one would make that journey in the middle of a winter storm. No one could make that journey. Mabel climbed the stairs to the second floor, her flashlight held steady despite the trembling in her hands. She emerged into the corridor and swept her beam along the length of the hallway. Empty. The doors to the guest rooms were all closed, just as they should be. The footsteps had ceased. Mabel stood perfectly still, listening, but heard only the wind battering against the building and the rapid beating of her own heart. She walked slowly down the corridor, checking each door to ensure it remained locked. Everything was secure. Nothing was out of place. Yet Mabel could not shake the certainty that she had heard someone walking above her head, someone whose footsteps had a weight and solidity that could not be explained by settling timber or expanding metal pipes. She completed her rounds and returned to her apartment, telling herself that the storm was playing tricks on her perception, that isolation and darkness could make anyone imagine things that were not really there. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at her small kitchen table, waiting for her nerves to settle. The wind continued its assault on the building, and somewhere in the darkness outside, something crashed with enough force that Mabel jumped in, her chair spilling hot tea across her hand. She cleaned up the mess and decided to go to bed early, pulling thick blankets over herself and trying to ignore the sounds of the storm. Sleep did not come easily. Mabel lay awake, listening to the building around her. And that was when she heard the footsteps again. They were in the corridor directly outside her apartment door, pacing back and forth with that same slow, measured rhythm. Mabel sat up in bed, her breath coming in short gasps. She could see the thin line of space beneath her door, and as she watched, a shadow moved across that space, blocking the faint light that came from the emergency exit sign at the end of the hallway. Someone was standing just outside her door. Someone was pacing back and forth mere feet from where she lay in bed. Mabel forced herself to get up, to cross the small room, to put her hand on the doorknob. She took a deep breath and pulled the door open quickly, her flashlight raised like a weapon. The corridor was empty, completely empty. But there, on the floor directly in front of her door, were footprints. They were wet, as though someone had walked through deep snow and then come inside without bothering to remove their boots. The footprints were impossibly large, each one nearly 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions spread wider apart than human toes should be. The prints led down the corridor toward the main building, leaving a wet trail across the worn carpet. Mabel followed the footprints with her flashlight beam. They continued to the end of the service corridor, turned right into the main hallway, and proceeded toward the grand lobby. As Mabel followed, she noticed that the footprints were not tracking snow or mud into the building. The wetness on the carpet was clear, like water, but it carried with it an overwhelming smell of pine and decay, of old growth forest and things that had died and rotted beneath trees that had stood for 1,000 years. The scent was so strong that Mabel had to cover her nose and mouth with her sleeve, fighting the urge to gag. The footprints ended at the wall opposite the grand staircase. They simply stopped, as though whoever or whatever had been walking had stepped directly through the solid log wall and disappeared. Mabel stood staring at the wall, her flashlight illuminating the ancient wood, and she felt something that she had not experienced in many years. She felt genuine fear, the kind that makes rational thought difficult and turns the stomach to ice. She backed away from the wall, turned, and hurried back to her apartment, locking the door behind her and pushing her dresser in front of it for good measure. She sat on her bed for the remainder of the night, fully dressed, flashlight in her lap, waiting for dawn to come. The storm finally broke on the third day, and Mabel used the satellite phone in the office to call the Park Service headquarters in Longmire. She reported what she had experienced, trying to keep her voice steady, trying not to sound like a frightened old woman who had let her imagination run wild during a winter storm. The ranger who took her call was polite but skeptical. He assured her that he would send someone up to check on her as soon as the roads could be cleared, which might take several days depending on conditions. Mabel thanked him and hung up the phone, knowing that no one would believe what she had witnessed. That night, the footsteps returned. Mabel heard them moving through the upper floors, pacing the corridors, climbing the stairs to the third floor where the most expensive suites were located. She heard doors opening and closing, heard the scrape of furniture being moved across wooden floors. She forced herself to investigate, driven by a stubborn refusal to be terrorized in a building where she had worked safely for 15 years. She climbed to the third floor and found chaos waiting for her there. Every door along the third floor corridor stood wide open. Furniture had been pulled out of the rooms into the hallway, chairs and tables and bed frames arranged in a pattern that Mabel could not understand. The arrangement formed a rough circle, with all the furniture facing inward toward a space at the center of the corridor. In that central space, written on the floor in what appeared to be water or melted snow, was a symbol that Mabel did not recognize. It looked ancient, like something that might have been carved into stone by people who lived in these mountains long before Europeans arrived with their maps and their names and their buildings. Mabel stood at the top of the staircase, staring at the impossible scene before her. And that was when she felt it. There was a presence in the corridor with her, something massive and old and utterly inhuman. She could not see it, but she could feel its attention focused on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The temperature in the corridor dropped so precipitously that her breath became clouds of vapor. The lights flickered, and then, written across the walls in letters that dripped and ran like water, words appeared: "Leave this place." Mabel did not sleep that night. She sat in her apartment with every light turned on, waiting for morning, wondering how she could possibly explain what was happening to anyone who had not witnessed it themselves. When dawn finally came, she packed a bag with essential belongings and prepared to abandon her post, to walk away from the job and the isolation and the thing that had made its displeasure with her presence abundantly clear. But before she could leave, Mabel decided she needed to understand what she was dealing with. She needed to know why this was happening. She drove down the mountain as soon as the road was passable, traveling to the park headquarters where she requested access to the historical archives. The clerk was surprised to see her, but granted her request, leading her to a storage room filled with boxes of old documents, photographs, and records dating back to the early days of the park. Mabel spent hours searching through yellowed papers and fading photographs until she found what she was looking for. The Paradise Inn had been built on land that local indigenous tribes considered sacred. The meadows around the building were not simply beautiful alpine landscapes. They were ceremonial grounds, places where important rituals had been conducted for generations before the arrival of white settlers. The tribes had protested the construction of the inn, had warned that building on sacred ground would anger the spirits that protected the mountain. Their warnings had been ignored. The inn was built anyway, and the tribes were pushed further from their ancestral lands. But according to the documents Mabel found, several construction workers had reported strange occurrences during the building process. Tools disappeared. Materials went missing. Men claimed to see a tall figure watching them from the tree line, a figure that left tracks in the snow too large to be human. Mabel found references to the Keeper, a spirit that the tribes believed guarded Mount Rainier from those who would disrespect the mountain or desecrate sacred places. The Keeper was described as ancient beyond measure, neither fully of the physical world nor entirely spirit, something that existed in the spaces between. The Keeper did not harm those who treated the mountain with respect, but it drove away those who did not belong, those who took without giving, those who built without asking permission. Mabel returned to the Paradise Inn with offerings. She brought cedar branches and tobacco, items that the indigenous people had traditionally used in their ceremonies. She arranged the offerings in the grand lobby and spoke aloud to the emptiness, apologizing for the intrusion, acknowledging that she and all the others who worked at the inn were guests on land that did not belong to them. She promised to treat the building and the mountain with greater respect, to remember that she was living in a place that had been sacred long before it had been turned into a tourist destination. The footsteps stopped after that night. The furniture was never moved again. The doors remained closed and locked as they should be. Mabel completed her contract that winter and returned for many winters after. She never again heard the footsteps in the corridors above her head, never again saw the impossibly large tracks in the wet snow. But on certain nights when the wind blew cold across the mountain, Mabel would sometimes catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows at the edge of the forest. A tall figure standing among the trees, watching the inn with an attention that felt both protective and warning. the keeper was still there, still guarding the sacred ground, still making its presence known to those who had the wisdom to pay attention. Doris Elkhart moved to the isolated logging town of Cedar Creek in the spring of 1991. Drawn by the promise of affordable housing and the kind of quiet mountain living that had become impossible to find in the rapidly growing cities of Western Washington. She was 57 years old, recently retired from a career in elementary education, and eager to spend her remaining years in a place where the pace of life moved slower and neighbors still knew each other by name. Cedar Creek seemed perfect for her needs. The town consisted of fewer than 200 permanent residents, most of them connected in one way or another to the logging industry that had sustained the community for nearly a century. The houses were modest but well maintained. The main street featured a general store and a small diner, and the surrounding forest pressed close on all sides, creating a sense of peaceful isolation that Doris found deeply appealing. The people of Cedar Creek were welcoming enough when Doris first arrived. Her neighbors helped her move furniture into the small two-bedroom house she had purchased at the end of Maple Street. The woman who ran the general store learned her preferences and made sure to stock the brands of tea and coffee that Doris favored. The men who gathered at the diner each morning for breakfast nodded politely when she came in for her occasional meal. Yet despite this surface friendliness, Doris sensed something guarded in the way the townspeople interacted with her. Conversations would stop abruptly when she entered a room. People exchanged meaningful glances that she could not interpret. There was a sense of secrets being kept, of information being withheld, of a community that had closed ranks around something they did not want outsiders to know. Doris attributed this guardedness to the natural suspicion that small towns often harbored toward newcomers. She assumed that with time and patience, she would be accepted more fully into the community's social fabric. She volunteered at the small local library, helped organize a cleanup day at the town's only park, and made genuine efforts to establish relationships with her neighbors. The townspeople remained polite but distant, friendly on the surface, but careful never to let her get too close. Doris found this frustrating, but not entirely unexpected. She told herself that earning true acceptance in a place like Cedar Creek would take years, not months. Then autumn arrived, and with it came mention of the Harvest Festival. Doris first heard about the festival in late September when she stopped by the general store to purchase supplies. The owner, a woman named Margaret Simmons, who had lived in Cedar Creek her entire life, was discussing arrangements with several other longtime residents. They spoke about food preparation, about coordinating schedules, about ensuring that everything would be ready when the time came. When Doris asked about the festival and whether she might be able to attend or help with preparations, the conversation stopped immediately. Margaret looked uncomfortable, exchanging glances with the other customers before explaining in carefully chosen words that the Harvest Festival was a private community event, limited to families who had lived in Cedar Creek for multiple generations. Newcomers, she said with an apologetic smile, were not invited to participate until they had resided in the town for 7 full seasons. It was tradition, Margaret explained, nothing personal. Doris was surprised by this explanation, but tried not to take offense. She understood that rural communities often maintain traditions that seemed strange to outsiders. 7 seasons seemed like an arbitrary and excessive waiting period, but she supposed that every town had its peculiarities. She thanked Margaret for explaining and left the store, dismissing the matter as just another example of small-town insularity. But as October progressed, Doris noticed that the atmosphere in Cedar Creek began to change. The The townspeople became increasingly distracted and excited, speaking in hushed tones about the upcoming festival. Children were kept close to home after school. The logging crews began working shorter hours, returning from the forest earlier each day. There was a sense of anticipation building, a feeling of something important approaching that had nothing to do with Halloween or any holiday that Doris recognized. The Harvest Festival was scheduled for the night of the new moon in late October, a date that seemed deliberately chosen to coincide with the darkest night of the month. On the day of the festival, the entire town shut down. The general store closed early. The diner served its last meal at noon and locked its doors. Doris watched from her front porch as her neighbors prepared to leave their homes, dressed in simple dark clothing and carrying bundles wrapped in cloth. They walked in small family groups toward the edge of town, where a trail led deep into the surrounding forest. No one spoke. No one made eye contact with Doris as they passed. By nightfall, Cedar Creek was completely empty, except for Doris herself. Sitting alone in her house and wondering what kind of festival required the entire population to disappear into the woods in the middle of the night. Curiosity overcame caution. Doris had never been comfortable with being excluded, and the secrecy surrounding the Harvest Festival had grown from mildly annoying to genuinely disturbing. She told herself that she simply wanted to understand the community she had chosen to join, that observing the festival from a distance would help her appreciate the traditions that were clearly so important to the people of Cedar Creek. She put on dark clothing, grabbed a flashlight that she kept switched off, and set out along the trail that led into the forest. The night was moonless and profoundly dark. The tall trees blocked what little starlight penetrated the cloud cover, and Doris had to move carefully to avoid tripping over roots and rocks that she could barely see in the darkness. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she began to see a glow through the trees ahead. Firelight, flickering and dancing, illuminating the trunks of ancient cedars and casting shadows that moved like living things across the forest floor. Doris could hear voices now, many voices, chanting in unison. The words were not in any language she recognized. They had a rhythmic quality, rising and falling in patterns that seemed designed to match the crackle and roar of what must be a very large fire. Doris left the trail and moved through the underbrush as quietly as she could, approaching the source of the light from an angle that would allow her to observe without being seen. What Doris saw when she reached the edge of a large clearing took her breath away and filled her with an immediate and overwhelming sense of wrongness. The entire population of Cedar Creek had gathered in a natural amphitheater formed by massive cedar trees, some of which had to be hundreds of years old. In the center of the clearing burned a bonfire of extraordinary size, flames reaching 30 feet into the air and throwing off waves of heat that Doris could feel even from her concealed position at the edge of the tree line. The townspeople had arranged themselves in concentric circles around the fire, all facing inward, all chanting in that strange language that resonated in Doris's chest and made her teeth ache. At the very center of the gathering, closest to the fire, stood what appeared to be 5 large human figures. They were constructed from bundles of branches and brush, bound together with rope and positioned upright on wooden frames that kept them standing despite their awkward construction. Each figure was roughly 8 feet tall, shaped to suggest a human form with outstretched arms and a rounded head. They were clearly effigies, representations of human shapes meant to be burned in the fire as part of some ritual that Doris did not understand. She had read about similar practices in various cultures, symbolic burnings meant to represent the end of harvest season or the warding off of winter's darkness. The sight was unsettling but not immediately alarming. Then the chanting changed. The rhythm accelerated, becoming more urgent, more frenzied. The townspeople began to move, swaying in place, some of them dancing with jerking movements that looked more like seizures than coordinated motion. Margaret Simmons, the kindly store owner who had always been so pleasant to Doris, stepped forward from the crowd. She was carrying something in her arms, something wrapped in white cloth. Other people came forward as well, each carrying similar bundles. They approached the 5 effigies and began unwrapping the cloth, revealing what lay beneath. Doris felt her stomach lurch and had to clap a hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. The bundles contained bones, human bones, skulls and rib cages and long bones from arms and legs, old and yellowed with age, but unmistakably human. The townspeople were carefully positioning these bones within the effigies, weaving them into the framework of branches and brush, transforming what Doris had thought were simple symbolic figures into something far more disturbing. These were not representations of humans. These were structures built around actual human remains. The effigies were not purely symbolic. They were monuments to death, reliquaries constructed from the bodies of people who had died in ways that Doris could not begin to imagine. Margaret Simmons began to speak, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. She was not speaking in the strange language anymore, but in perfectly ordinary English, with the same friendly tone she used when helping customers at the general store. She spoke about prosperity and protection, about the bargain that had been struck generations ago when the logging industry had first come to this valley. She spoke about the forest spirits who had ruled these woods since time immemorial, ancient powers that demanded tribute in exchange for allowing humans to take the trees that were their children. She spoke about the 5 founders of Cedar Creek, the original loggers who had discovered the ritual and performed it first, who had given themselves willingly to the forest so that their descendants could prosper and the logging could continue without disaster or ruin. The chanting resumed, louder now, building toward some crescendo that Doris desperately did not want to witness. The townspeople began feeding the effigies into the bonfire, one at a time, lifting the heavy structures and carrying them forward until they could tip them into the flames. The first effigy hit the fire with an explosion of sparks and a sound like screaming. Though whether the sound came from burning wood or something else, Doris could not be certain. The smell that rose from the fire was nauseating. A combination of burning pine and something far more organic, far more disturbing. It was the smell of burning bone, of flesh that had long since dried and mummified, but still contained enough organic material to produce that distinctive stench of cremation. Doris knew she had to leave, had to get away from this place before she was discovered. If the townspeople found her here, witnessing their secret ritual, their carefully guarded tradition, she did not think they would simply escort her home with a polite warning to mind her own business. She began to back away from the clearing, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. She had made it perhaps 50 feet when her foot came down on a dry branch that snapped with a crack like a gunshot. The chanting stopped instantly. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. Doris froze, not daring to breathe, knowing that hundreds of eyes were now searching the darkness at the edge of the clearing. A voice called out. It was Margaret Simmons again, but her tone was no longer friendly. She called for people to search the perimeter to find whoever was hiding in the trees. Doris heard movement, heard people crashing through the underbrush on either side of her position. She abandoned any attempt at stealth and ran, crashing through the forest in blind panic, her only thought to reach the trail and get back to town before they caught her. She could hear them behind her, calling to each other, coordinating their search. They knew these woods far better than she did. They could navigate in the darkness that left her stumbling and disoriented. Doris was not sure how she found the trail. Perhaps instinct guided her, or perhaps simple luck allowed her to blunder onto the path just when her pursuers were closing in. She ran harder than she had run in decades, her lungs burning, her heart hammering in her chest. She could still hear them behind her, but could not tell how close they were or how many. When she finally burst out of the tree line and into the empty streets of Cedar Creek, she did not stop running. She ran straight to her house, slammed the door behind her, and locked every window and door. She pulled her curtains closed and sat in the darkness, listening, waiting to hear footsteps on her porch or fists pounding on her door. The footsteps never came. No one knocked. As dawn broke over Cedar Creek, Doris watched through a crack in her curtains as her neighbors returned from the forest, walking in small groups, speaking quietly to each other, looking like ordinary people returning from an ordinary community event. They dispersed to their homes and disappeared inside. By mid-morning, the town seemed completely normal. The general store opened. The diner began serving breakfast. It was as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Doris packed her belongings that day. She loaded everything she could fit into her car and drove away from Cedar Creek without looking back, abandoning the house she had purchased and the quiet life she had hoped to build. She never reported what she had seen. Who would believe her? What evidence did she have beyond her own testimony? She had no photographs, no proof. Nothing but memories of fire and bones, and the faces of ordinary people engaged in something that should not exist in the modern world. Years later, Doris would sometimes see news stories about Cedar Creek, about the logging operations that continued to thrive there while other timber towns struggled and failed. She would see photographs of the town and recognize faces, people who had been in that clearing, people who had fed human remains into a bonfire while chanting to forest spirits. They looked so normal in the photographs, so ordinary and harmless. But Doris knew better. She knew what they were capable of, what they had done to ensure their prosperity. She knew about the bargain their ancestors had struck and the terrible price that had been paid to keep that bargain alive. Eugene Pemberton served as the lighthouse keeper at Cape Perpetua for 37 years before his mysterious disappearance in March of 1989. He was a man of habit and routine, qualities that served him well in a profession that demanded absolute reliability and attention to detail. The lighthouse at Cape Perpetua stood on a rocky promontory that jutted into the Pacific Ocean, a towering white structure that had guided ships safely past treacherous coastal rocks since 1874. Eugene had inherited the position from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Pembertons had kept the light burning, had maintained the station, had watched over the dangerous waters where the Oregon coast met the full fury of the Pacific. Eugene lived alone in the keeper's cottage adjacent to the lighthouse tower. His wife had passed away in 1982, and his children had long since moved to inland cities where employment opportunities were more abundant. He did not mind the solitude. In fact, he preferred it. The isolation of the lighthouse station suited his temperament perfectly. He kept meticulous records of weather conditions, ship traffic, and maintenance activities. His logbooks were models of precision and clarity, documenting every detail of his daily routine with an almost obsessive thoroughness that his superiors in the Coast Guard had come to depend upon. In early March of 1989, Eugene's logbook entries began to change. The first unusual notation appeared on March 3rd. Eugene wrote that he had observed a sailing vessel approaching the lighthouse at approximately 2 a.m. The ship was a 3-masted schooner, running with full sails despite the calm conditions and lack of wind. Eugene had attempted to contact the vessel by radio, but received no response. He noted that the ship's running lights appeared unusually dim, and that its course seemed erratic, as though the captain was uncertain of the proper heading. The ship had eventually turned away from the coast and disappeared into the darkness. Eugene concluded the entry by noting that no vessel matching that description was listed on any of the shipping schedules he maintained, and that weather conditions at the time made sailing under full canvas both unusual and unnecessary. The second entry came on March 5th. Eugene reported seeing the same schooner again, this time approaching even closer to shore. He described the vessel in greater detail, noting that its sails appeared to be made of canvas that was badly weathered and stained. The ship's hull showed signs of extensive damage, with visible gaps in the planking near the waterline. Eugene wrote that he had again attempted radio contact with no success. This time, however, he reported hearing voices calling out from the ship. The voices were speaking, but Eugene could not identify the language. He wrote that it sounded older than words, a phrase that his supervisor would later find particularly unsettling. The ship had once again turned away before reaching the rocks, sailing back out to sea despite the fact that Eugene could observe no wind strong enough to fill its sails. Over the next week, Eugene's entries became increasingly detailed and increasingly disturbing. The schooner appeared every night, always between the hours of midnight and dawn, always approaching the lighthouse before turning away at the last moment. Eugene began to recognize individual crew members on the deck of the ship. He described them as wearing clothing that seemed decades out of date. Heavy wool coats and caps that reminded him of photographs he had seen from the late 19th century. The crew members would call out to him, their voices carrying clearly across the water despite the distance and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks. Eugene still could not understand the words they spoke, but he became convinced that they were trying to communicate something important. On March 10th, Eugene's entry took a dramatic turn. He wrote that he had finally been able to make out some of what the crew was saying. They were calling his name over and over again. Voices from the ship were calling Eugene Pemberton across the dark water. The captain of the vessel, a tall figure who stood at the wheel on the quarterdeck, had raised his hand and beckoned to Eugene, gesturing for him to come aboard. Eugene wrote that he had felt an almost overwhelming compulsion to respond to that gesture, to leave the lighthouse and find some way to reach the ship that called to him every night. He resisted the compulsion, he wrote, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to do so. The March 12th entry was even more alarming. Eugene reported that the crew had been asking him to join them for 6 consecutive nights. He wrote that the captain had called out to him in perfect English, explaining that they had been sailing these waters since before the lighthouse was built. Eugene described seeing the faces of the crew members clearly for the first time, illuminated by lanterns that cast a pale greenish light across the deck of the schooner. He recognized those faces. They belonged to men who had died during the construction of the lighthouse in 1874. Workers who had fallen from the scaffolding or been swept into the sea by rogue waves. Eugene knew their names from the memorial plaque that had been installed at the base of the lighthouse tower. Thomas Whitmore, Samuel Chen, Patrick O'Brien, James Newcastle, 15 men in total who had perished before the lighthouse was completed. Eugene's penultimate entry was brief and chilling. He wrote that he now understood why the dead men kept returning to Cape Perpetua. The lighthouse had been built on ground that should have remained empty. The rocky promontory was a sacred site, a place where indigenous peoples had conducted ceremonies for the dead for countless generations before white settlers arrived and claimed the land for their own purposes. The spirits of the men who died building the lighthouse could not rest because the structure itself was an intrusion, a violation of sacred ground. They were trapped between life and death, sailing eternally along a coastline they could never leave, calling out to the living in hopes of finding someone who could understand their plight. The final entry in Eugene Pemberton's logbook was dated March 14th, 1989. The handwriting was shaky, less precise than Eugene's usual careful script. He wrote that the ship had approached closer than ever before, so close that he could have thrown a stone and hit its hull. The captain had called to him again, inviting him to join the crew. Eugene wrote that he could see now that the captain was his own grandfather, Jeremiah Pemberton, who had supposedly retired from the lighthouse service in 1923 and moved to Portland, where he had died of pneumonia in 1925. But here was Jeremiah standing on the deck of the ghostly schooner, looking exactly as he appeared in the old photographs that Eugene kept in his cottage. Jeremiah explained that he had never actually left Cape Perpetua, that the lighthouse keepers never truly left, that they all eventually joined the crew of the ship that sailed these waters forever. Eugene's final words were, "They have been asking me to join their crew for 6 days now. The captain says they have been sailing these waters since before the lighthouse was built. I can see their faces clearly now. They are the men who died building this place in 1874. Tonight, I understand why they keep returning. Tonight, I will give them the answer they have been waiting for." Coast Guard investigators arrived at Cape Perpetua on March 16th after Eugene failed to respond to scheduled radio check-ins. They found the lighthouse in perfect operational order. The light was functioning properly, the lens was clean, all equipment was maintained to the exacting standards that Eugene had always upheld. His cottage was neat and organized, with no signs of struggle or distress. His coat still hung on its peg by the door. His breakfast dishes from March 14th were washed and put away. The logbook sat open on his desk to the final entry. Eugene Pemberton himself was nowhere to be found. A thorough search of the station and the surrounding area revealed no trace of the missing keeper. There were no footprints leading away from the lighthouse, no indication that Eugene had packed belongings or prepared to leave. The only boat at the station remained tied to the small dock, undamaged and unused. Eugene had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but his carefully maintained records and that final cryptic entry in his logbook. The Coast Guard officially classified Eugene's disappearance as unexplained and eventually presumed him dead after the statutory period elapsed. The lighthouse was automated shortly thereafter, no longer requiring a human keeper to maintain its operation. But local fishermen who work the waters off Cape Perpetua report that on foggy nights, particularly during the dark of the moon, they sometimes see a figure standing in the lighthouse tower. The figure waves at passing ships, warning them away from the dangerous rocks below, keeping watch over the coastline just as Eugene Pemberton did for 37 years. And occasionally, very occasionally, fishermen report seeing a 3-masted schooner sailing through the fog near Cape Perpetua. The ship runs with full sails despite the absence of wind, its crew visible on deck, calling out in voices that sound like wind and waves and grief. Those who claim to have seen the ship say that among the crew is a figure who looks remarkably like the photographs of Eugene Pemberton that were published in newspapers after his disappearance. He stands at the rail, watching the lighthouse he once tended, forever sailing the waters he spent his life making safe for others, unable to leave the place that claimed him in the end. Gladys Morrison volunteered for a university psychological study in the winter of 1993 that required spending 6 weeks alone in a remote cabin in the Olympic National Forest. She was 61 years old, a retired librarian with no close family ties, and a genuine curiosity about the limits of human endurance in isolation. The study was being conducted by researchers from the University of Washington's Psychology Department, investigating the effects of complete solitude on cognitive function, emotional stability, and sensory perception. Gladys had read about similar experiments and found the concept fascinating. The compensation was generous, and more importantly, she would be contributing to scientific understanding of how the human mind coped with extended periods of alone time. The researchers explained the protocol in detail during the preliminary meetings. Gladys would be taken to a cabin located approximately 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail. The cabin was equipped with basic necessities: a wood stove for heating, a propane stove for cooking, sufficient food supplies for the entire 6-week period, water from a nearby spring, and a chemical toilet. There would be no electricity, no telephone, no contact with the outside world except for weekly radio check-ins with the research team. During these check-ins, which would occur every Sunday at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Gladys would answer a series of standardized questions about her mental state, her sleep patterns, and any unusual experiences or observations. The researchers would monitor her responses for signs of psychological distress, and if necessary, they could terminate the experiment early and extract her from the location. Gladys signed the consent forms and underwent a complete physical and psychological evaluation to ensure she was suitable for the study. The researchers seemed satisfied with her baseline assessments. She was intelligent, emotionally stable, and had realistic expectations about the challenges of extended isolation. In early January, on a gray morning when frost covered every surface and her breath formed clouds in the cold air, Gladys was driven to the trailhead and escorted to the cabin by 2 research assistants, who carried her supplies and explained the operation of the radio equipment one final time. Then they left, and then Gladys found herself alone in a way she had never experienced before. The first week passed more easily than Gladys had anticipated. She established a routine that gave structure to her days. She woke with the dawn, prepared a simple breakfast, spent the morning reading from the selection of books the researchers had provided, took a walk in the afternoon to gather firewood and observe the forest around her, prepared dinner, and spent the evening writing in the journal she had been asked to maintain. The silence was profound, but not oppressive. Gladys found that she enjoyed the absence of human noise, the constant background hum of civilization that she had lived with for her entire life without really noticing until it was gone. The second week brought the first signs of difficulty. Gladys began to notice that the silence was not truly complete. The forest was full of sounds: wind moving through the trees, branches creaking, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the distant call of birds. Her mind began to interpret these natural sounds in strange ways. A falling pine cone became footsteps on the cabin roof. The wind rattling a loose shutter became someone trying to open the door. Gladys understood that this was a normal psychological response to isolation, exactly the kind of phenomenon the researchers were interested in studying. She made detailed notes in her journal and reported these experiences during her Sunday radio check-in. The researchers assured her that auditory misinterpretation was common and expected. They told her to continue documenting these experiences, but not to be alarmed by them. By the third week, the sounds had evolved into something more distinct. Gladys was hearing voices. They came at night, after she had extinguished the lantern and lay in her narrow bed, listening to the darkness. The voices were faint at first, barely distinguishable from the wind, but they grew clearer with each passing night. They seemed to be coming from just outside the cabin, speaking in conversational tones too low for Gladys to make out specific words. She knew this was likely an auditory hallucination, a product of her isolated brain trying to create the human interaction it was being denied. She found the voices more fascinating than frightening, and she began to listen carefully, trying to determine if there were patterns in the sounds her mind was generating. During her third Sunday check-in, Gladys reported the voices to the research team. She described them clinically, using the precise language of someone who understood that she was experiencing a psychological phenomenon rather than an actual external stimulus. The lead researcher, Dr. Patricia Chen, seemed pleased with Gladys's observations. She explained that auditory hallucinations were a well-documented response to sensory deprivation and social isolation. Dr. Chen assured Gladys that as long as she maintained awareness that the voices were not real, there was no cause for concern. The experiment would continue as planned, but the voices did not remain ambiguous for long. By the fourth week, Gladys could understand what they were saying. There were three distinct voices: a woman, a man, and a child. They were talking to each other, carrying on mundane conversations about daily activities and simple observations about the weather and the forest. The woman's voice reminded Gladys of her own mother, who had passed away 15 years earlier. The man spoke with a gentle tone that suggested kindness and patience. The child, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 years old based on the pitch and cadence of her speech, asked questions with the innocent curiosity that Gladys remembered from her years working with children in the library. Gladys began to respond to the voices. At first, she simply acknowledged them, saying good evening when they appeared after dark, offering simple replies when they seemed to address her directly. The voices responded in turn, becoming more animated, more engaged. They introduced themselves. The woman was Margaret. The man was Thomas. The child was Susan. They told Gladys that they had lived in this part of the forest long ago, that they had been a family here before something terrible happened. They did not specify what that terrible thing had been, but Gladys sensed profound sadness in their voices when they spoke of it. By the beginning of the 5th week, the voices had become constant companions. They spoke to Gladys throughout the day, not just at night. Margaret would comment on the meals Gladys prepared, offering suggestions for how to improve the flavor with herbs that grew near the cabin. Thomas would discuss the weather, warning Gladys when storms were approaching. Susan would ask Gladys to read aloud from her books, and Gladys would comply, finding comfort in the act of reading to an audience, even if that audience existed only in her own mind. She knew, on some level, that she was losing her grip on reality. She knew that healthy people did not have extended conversations with hallucinations. But she also felt less lonely than she had at any point in the experiment. And loneliness, she reasoned, was far more dangerous than friendly voices. The scheduled check-in on the fifth Sunday revealed the extent of Gladys's deterioration. When Dr. Chen asked the standard questions about unusual experiences, Gladys spoke enthusiastically about her new friends. She described Margaret, Thomas, and Susan in detail, explaining how helpful they had been, how much comfort their presence provided. Dr. Chen's voice over the radio became tense. She asked Gladys directly whether she understood that these individuals were not real. Gladys hesitated, then admitted that she was no longer certain. The voices seemed real enough. They knew things that Gladys did not know, like where to find the best firewood or which berries near the cabin were safe to eat. How could hallucinations possess knowledge that she herself did not have? Dr. Chen made the decision to terminate the experiment immediately. She told Gladys that a team would arrive the following morning to escort her back to civilization. Gladys agreed calmly, but after the radio check-in ended, Margaret's voice spoke clearly in the cabin. She warned Gladys that the researchers would try to separate them, that leaving the cabin would mean losing the only friends Gladys had. Thomas agreed, his voice taking on an urgent quality. He reminded Gladys how lonely she had been before they arrived, how empty her life would be without their companionship. Susan began to cry, pleading with Gladys not to abandon them. When the research team arrived at the cabin on Monday morning, they found Gladys sitting calmly at the small table, a pot of tea steeping in front of her. She had arranged 3 empty chairs around the table, and she was speaking animatedly to the air as though engaged in conversation with invisible companions. Dr. Chen entered the cabin cautiously, assessing the situation. She called Gladys's name. Gladys turned and smiled, apparently pleased to see her. She gestured to the empty chairs and introduced the researchers to Margaret, Thomas, and little Susan, who were sitting right there. And would they like some tea as well? Dr. Chen attempted to convince Gladys to leave the cabin. She explained gently but firmly that the experiment was over, that Gladys needed to return with them for psychological evaluation and treatment. Gladys listened politely, then shook her head. She explained that she could not possibly leave now. Her friends needed her. They had been alone in this forest for so long, trapped here by the tragedy that had befallen them. Margaret had finally told her the full story just that morning. In the winter of 1932, a family had been caught in a terrible blizzard while hiking through this area. They had taken shelter in a trapper's cabin that had once stood on this very spot. They had frozen to death, waiting for a rescue that never came. Their bodies had not been found until spring. Now their spirits remained here, lonely and frightened, desperate for human contact and companionship. Gladys explained all of this in a calm, rational tone that made her delusion all the more disturbing. She told Dr. Chen that she had decided to stay at the cabin permanently. The experiment was over for the researchers, but it was just beginning for her. She finally had a purpose, a reason to be needed. She would keep Margaret, Thomas, and Susan company. She would make sure they were never lonely again. The research team could report whatever they wanted to report, but Gladys was not leaving. Dr. Chen spent 3 hours trying to reason with Gladys, trying different approaches, different arguments. Nothing worked. Gladys remained adamant that she was staying. Eventually, Dr. Chen made the difficult decision to have Gladys removed from the cabin against her will. It took 2 research assistants to physically guide Gladys out of the cabin while she protested and called out to her invisible friends, promising them that she would return, that she would not abandon them. forever. As they led her down the trail toward civilization and the psychiatric evaluation that awaited her, Gladys kept looking back over her shoulder, tears streaming down her face, reaching toward something that only she could see. Walter Thornton had worked the night shift at Aberdeen's largest sawmill for 14 years, when the winter of 1988 brought a series of brutal murders that would terrorize the small logging community and haunt him for the remainder of his life. He was 59 years old, a shift supervisor responsible for overseeing the skeleton crew that kept the mill running through the dark hours between midnight and 8 in the morning. Aberdeen was a town built on timber, its entire economy dependent on the massive trees that were cut from the surrounding forests and processed into lumber at facilities like the one where Walter worked. The mill ran 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, the screaming of saw blades and the thunder of heavy machinery never ceasing except on Sundays, when even the most dedicated workers rested. The first victim was discovered on the morning of January 12th. Raymond Kowalski, a night shift worker who operated the debarking machine, had failed to show up for his shift that evening. His supervisor assumed he was sick and assigned another worker to cover his station. When Raymond's wife called the mill the following morning to report that her husband had never come home from work, a search was initiated. Raymond's truck was found in the employee parking lot, exactly where he had left it when he arrived for his shift the previous night. Raymond himself was discovered in the lumber yard, his body arranged among stacks of freshly cut 2x4s. Walter was called to the scene, along with the Aberdeen police. What he saw that morning would replay in his nightmares for years afterward. Raymond Kowalski had been killed with deliberate brutality, his body mutilated by what the investigating officers immediately recognized as sawmill equipment. Circular saw marks were visible on his torso and limbs. A lumber hook had been driven through his chest. The killer had used tools that every mill worker handled daily, had turned the instruments of their livelihood into weapons of shocking violence. The police cordoned off the area and began interviewing employees, but no one had seen anything unusual during the night shift. Raymond had simply vanished somewhere between the main building and the parking lot, and no one had noticed he was missing until it was too late. The second murder occurred exactly 1 week later. Martin Deschamps, who ran the planing machine during night operations, was found in a similar condition. His body had been positioned inside one of the massive storage sheds, where finished lumber awaited shipment. The same brutal methodology had been employed. Saw blades, industrial chisels, and the heavy steel hooks used for moving logs had all been used on Martin's body with a precision that suggested intimate familiarity with how those tools functioned. The Aberdeen police brought in detectives from the State Criminal Investigation Division. They established that both victims had worked the same shift, had been employed at the mill for similar lengths of time, and had both been killed using equipment from the facility where they worked. Walter attended both funerals. He had known Raymond and Martin for years, had supervised their work, had shared coffee with them during breaks. The senselessness of their deaths disturbed him almost as much as the brutality. Aberdeen was a small town where violent crime was rare. People knew each other. Doors were left unlocked. Children played outside without supervision. The idea that a killer was stalking mill workers, targeting them in the place where they earned their living, created an atmosphere of fear that settled over the town like fog from the nearby harbor. The third victim was discovered on February 2nd. Thomas Carlisle, a forklift operator on the night shift, was found in the boiler room. The fourth victim, Edward Chen, who worked in the shipping department, was discovered on February 9th in one of the equipment maintenance bays. The fifth victim, James Whitmore, a general laborer, was found on February 16th near the log pond, where raw timber was stored before processing. Each murder followed the same pattern. The victims worked night shift. They were killed with sawmill equipment. Their bodies were positioned in locations around the facility, always hidden, but always eventually discovered. The killers seemed to want the bodies found, seemed to be making some kind of statement that Walter and the investigators could not decipher. The mill owners considered shutting down night operations entirely, but the economic impact would have been devastating. Instead, they implemented new security measures. Guards were posted at all entrances. Workers were required to move in pairs. Police maintained a presence at the facility during night hours. Walter found himself watching his crew with suspicion, wondering if the killer might be someone he worked alongside every night, someone who smiled and joked and seemed completely ordinary, while harboring the capacity for such horrific violence. It was Walter who finally recognized the pattern. He was reviewing personnel files in the mill office, comparing the names of the victims, when he noticed something that the police had apparently missed. All 5 murdered men had been employed at the mill in 1981. All 5 had been working on the day shift on June 17th of that year, the day of the accident. Walter felt his blood run cold as he pulled the incident report from the archives and read through the details he had tried for 7 years to forget. The accident had occurred during routine logging operations at one of the harvest sites 20 miles east of Aberdeen. A massive Douglas fir had been improperly cut, the weight distribution misjudged by the felling crew. When the tree came down, it had fallen in an unexpected direction, crushing Samuel Morrison, a young logger who had been standing in what should have been a safe zone. Samuel had died instantly, his body so badly mangled that the casket at his funeral had been closed. The investigation had ruled the death accidental, the result of human error and the inherent dangers of logging work. No one had been held criminally responsible. The 6 men on the felling crew that day had been given additional safety training and returned to work after a brief suspension. Walter stared at the names on that felling crew list. Raymond Kowalski, Martin Deschamps, Thomas Carlyle, Edward Chen, James Whitmore, and one more name, David Patterson. Walter's hands were shaking as he picked up the phone and called the lead detective on the case. He explained what he had discovered, the connection between all 5 victims, the logging accident from 7 years ago. The detective listened carefully and asked the obvious question. Where was David Patterson now? Walter checked the shift schedule. David Patterson was currently on duty, working the night shift in the mill's main cutting room. The detective told Walter to stay where he was, that police were on their way. But Walter could not stay put. David Patterson was out there with the rest of the night crew, men who had no idea they might be working alongside a serial killer. Walter left the office and made his way through the facility toward the cutting room, the sounds of machinery echoing through the vast space. He found David Patterson standing alone near the largest circular saw, a massive blade that could cut through logs 3 feet in diameter. David was staring at the spinning blade with an expression that Walter could not quite read. Walter approached slowly, calling out David's name to be heard over the noise of the equipment. David turned, and Walter saw that he was crying, tears running down his face while his jaw was set in an expression of terrible determination. In his hand, David held a lumber hook, the same type of implement that had been used to kill Raymond Kowalski. Walter asked David to put down the hook. David shook his head slowly. He asked Walter if he remembered Samuel Morrison. Walter said that of course he remembered. Samuel had been 23 years old, newly married. with a baby daughter he would never see grow up. David said that Samuel had been his cousin, the closest friend he had in the world. David had been the one to find Samuel's body crushed beneath that massive tree. He had been the one to tell Samuel's wife that her husband was never coming home. David explained that the accident had not been an accident at all. The 6 men on that felling crew had been cutting corners, ignoring safety protocols because they were being pressured to meet quotas and maximize productivity. They had known the tree was dangerous. They had known that Samuel was standing too close. They had made the cut anyway, and Samuel had paid the price for their negligence. David had spent 7 years watching those men continue their lives, continue working, continue laughing and joking as though they had not killed his cousin through their carelessness and greed. Walter tried to reason with David, tried to explain that revenge would not bring Samuel back, that David would be throwing away his own life. But David was beyond reason. He had already thrown away his life, he said. He had thrown it away the moment he decided that the men responsible for Samuel's death needed to face justice that the courts had failed to provide. There was only one name left on his list. Only one more man who needed to pay for what had happened on that June day 7 years ago. David raised the lumber hook and stepped toward Walter. And Walter realized with horror that David had not been using an old personnel file to identify the men from the felling crew. David had been there that day. David knew exactly who had been responsible. But David had made one critical error. Walter had not been on the felling crew. Walter had been working at the mill that day, nowhere near the logging site where Samuel Morrison died. Walter pointed this out, his voice steady despite his fear. He told David to check his facts, to look at the personnel records one more time. David hesitated, confusion replacing certainty in his expression. That moment of hesitation gave the police time to arrive, to flood into the cutting room with weapons drawn, to surround David Patterson and order him to drop the lumber hook and surrender. David complied. He set down the hook and allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance. As the police led him away, he turned to look at Walter one final time. He apologized for the mistake, for nearly killing an innocent man. He said he had been so certain, so focused on finishing what he had started, that he had not verified the final name on his list. Walter watched David being taken into custody and felt nothing but profound sadness. Another life destroyed by that accident 7 years ago. Another victim of the logging industry's constant demand for productivity and profit. The 6th and final member of the felling crew, whose name Walter never learned, left Aberdeen the night David Patterson was arrested. He disappeared into wherever people go when they are running from the consequences of their actions. The Aberdeen sawmill implemented new safety protocols and held mandatory training sessions on workplace responsibility. But Walter knew that no amount of training would prevent future accidents in an industry where profit would always be prioritized over safety. He worked 1 more year at the mill and then retired, unable to continue working in a place where he could still see Raymond Kowalski's body among the lumber stacks every time he closed his eyes. Beatrice Hammond had worked as a ferry operator between the San Juan Islands for over 20 years when she first encountered the vessel that would haunt her for the remainder of her career. She was 55 years old in the autumn of 1996, a veteran of the Washington State ferry system who had navigated the treacherous waters of Puget Sound in every kind of weather imaginable. Beatrice knew these waters better than she knew the streets of her own neighborhood. She could judge tide and current by instinct alone, could pilot her vessel through fog so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet, could dock at any of the island terminals with a precision that younger operators admired and tried unsuccessfully to emulate. She'd seen nearly everything the sea could throw at her, or so she believed, until that November night when the phantom ferry appeared for the first time. The evening had started routinely enough. Beatrice was making the final run of the day from Friday Harbor to Orcas Island, her ferry carrying only a handful of passengers and 3 vehicles. Winter was approaching, and tourist traffic had dwindled to almost nothing. The locals who depended on the ferry system for transportation between islands were accustomed to the reduced schedule and the long, dark evenings that came with the season. Beatrice enjoyed these quiet runs. She could focus on the simple pleasure of navigation, of guiding her vessel through water that reflected the lights of distant towns like scattered stars. The fog rolled in around 8 o'clock, thick and unseasonably dense. Beatrice reduced her speed and switched on the forward searchlights, their beams cutting through the murk and illuminating swirling banks of mist that seemed to have substance and weight. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. Beatrice relied on her instruments and her knowledge of the route, following coordinates and depth soundings that told her exactly where she was, even when she could see almost nothing of her surroundings. This was not the first time she had navigated in heavy fog, and it would not be the last. That was when she saw it. A vessel emerged from the fog bank ahead of her, moving on a course that would intersect with her own if neither ship altered heading. Beatrice immediately reduced speed further and reached for her radio to establish contact. She could see that the other vessel was a ferry, but it was unlike any ferry currently operating in the Puget Sound system. The design was old-fashioned, with a profile that reminded Beatrice of photographs she had seen from the 1940s. The ferry's running lights were visible but strangely dim, casting a pale yellow glow that seemed to be absorbed by the fog rather than penetrating it. No name was visible on the hull, and Beatrice could see passengers moving behind windows that were illuminated from within by what appeared to be incandescent bulbs rather than modern fluorescent lighting. Beatrice keyed her radio and called out on the standard maritime frequency, requesting identification and coordination for safe passage. The response came immediately, but the quality of the transmission was poor, filled with static and interference that made the words difficult to understand. A man's voice identified himself as Captain Robert McKinnon of the MV Kalakala, requesting permission to proceed to the Friday Harbor terminal. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of her enclosed bridge. She knew the name Kalakala. Every ferry operator in the Puget Sound knew that name. The MV Kalakala had been an iconic vessel, a streamlined Art Deco ferry that had operated between Seattle and Bremerton for decades before being decommissioned in 1967 and eventually sold to owners in Alaska who had moved it far from its original waters. More importantly, Beatrice knew that Captain Robert McKinnon had died in 1951 when the Kalakala sank during a Christmas Eve storm while attempting an unauthorized crossing to the San Juan Islands. The official investigation had concluded that McKinnon had been attempting to make extra runs during the holiday season, transporting islanders who were desperate to reach their families despite dangerous weather conditions. The ferry had gone down with 43 passengers and crew aboard. There had been no survivors. The wreck had never been located, lost somewhere in the deep waters between the islands where currents and depth made recovery operations nearly impossible. Beatrice stared at the vessel in front of her, her rational mind insisting that what she was seeing could not possibly be real, while her eyes told her a different story. The phantom ferry continued to approach, and Beatrice could now see details that made the impossible nature of the situation even more apparent. The passengers visible through the windows were dressed in clothing from the 1950s. Women wore long coats and hats with veils. Men wore fedoras and heavy wool overcoats. Children pressed their faces against the glass, waving at Beatrice's ferry with the innocent enthusiasm of young travelers excited to be on a boat. None of them seemed to realize that anything was wrong, that they were sailing on a vessel that should not exist, heading toward a destination they would never reach. Captain McKinnon's voice came through the radio again, clearer now. He repeated his request for permission to dock at Friday Harbor. He explained that he was running behind schedule due to the weather, that his passengers were anxious to reach the islands before Christmas Eve ended, that families were waiting. Beatrice found herself responding automatically, her training taking over, while her conscious mind struggled to process what was happening. She granted clearance for the Kalakala to proceed, then watched as the Phantom Ferry acknowledged her transmission and altered course slightly, heading toward Friday Harbor on a route that would take it directly past Beatrice's position. The two vessels passed within 100 yards of each other. Beatrice stood at her bridge windows, staring across the dark water at the impossible sight. She could see Captain McKinnon standing at the wheel of the Kalakala, a tall figure in a captain's uniform from another era. He raised his hand in a salute as the vessels passed, a gesture of professional courtesy between mariners. Beatrice raised her own hand in response, unable to do anything else. She watched as the Phantom Ferry continued toward Friday Harbor, its dim lights fading into the fog. Then, just before it disappeared entirely, the vessel simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, solid and real. The next moment it was gone, leaving behind only empty water and swirling mist. Beatrice completed her run to Orcas Island in a state of shock. She said nothing to her passengers or crew, uncertain how to explain what she had witnessed, unsure whether anyone would believe her, even if she tried. She completed her shift and returned to Friday Harbor, where she immediately checked with the terminal staff to see if another ferry had docked while she was making her run. No other vessels had arrived. The harbor had been empty all evening. Beatrice went home and spent the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if exhaustion or stress had caused her to hallucinate the entire encounter. But the Phantom Ferry appeared again. It happened 3 weeks later, on another foggy night during another late run between the islands. The same vessel emerged from the mist. The same voice requested permission to dock. The same impossible sight unfolded before Beatrice's eyes. This time she attempted to photograph the Phantom Ferry with a camera she had brought specifically for that purpose. But the images showed only fog and darkness. The Kalakala refused to be captured on film, as though it existed in a wavelength of reality that cameras could not detect. Over the following years, Beatrice encountered the Phantom Ferry 17 times. The sightings always occurred on foggy nights, usually during the winter months, always when she was making late runs with few passengers aboard. The pattern became familiar. Captain McKinnon would request permission to dock. Beatrice would grant clearance. The vessels would pass. The Phantom Ferry would fade into nothingness before reaching its destination. Beatrice began to recognize some of the passengers visible through the windows. A young woman in a red coat who always stood near the bow. An elderly man who sat in the forward cabin reading a newspaper. A little girl who pressed her face against the glass and waved with both hands. Beatrice eventually shared her experiences with other ferry operators, expecting skepticism or ridicule. Instead, she discovered that she was not alone. Several other veteran operators had encountered the Kalakala over the years, though most were reluctant to discuss their sightings openly for fear of being thought mentally unstable. There was an unofficial understanding among those who worked the waters around the San Juan Islands. On certain nights, when the fog was thick and the sea was dark, Captain McKinnon still made his rounds. He was still attempting to complete that final Christmas Eve run, still trying to bring his passengers home to their families, still hoping that this time he would succeed where he had failed in 1951. Beatrice tried to research the history of the sinking, hoping to understand why the phantom ferry continued to appear. She discovered that the Kalakala's final voyage had been unauthorized and desperate. Many of the passengers had been islanders who had traveled to the mainland for Christmas shopping and celebrations, people who had waited too long to return home and found themselves stranded when the regular ferry service was suspended due to deteriorating weather conditions. Captain McKinnon had taken pity on them, had agreed to make one final run despite warnings from his superiors and the Coast Guard that the crossing was too dangerous to attempt. The ferry had departed Seattle at 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve, with 43 souls aboard, all of them eager to reach the San Juan Islands before Christmas morning. Witnesses on shore reported seeing the Kalakala's lights disappearing into the storm, heading north into waters that were being lashed by winds exceeding 50 miles per hour and waves that reached heights of 15 feet. The vessel never arrived at its destination. No distress call was ever received. No wreckage was ever found. The 43 passengers and crew simply vanished, leaving behind grieving families who spent Christmas Day waiting for loved ones who would never return. Beatrice came to believe that Captain McKinnon and his passengers were trapped in a kind of temporal loop, forever attempting to complete that fatal journey, forever hoping that this time they would succeed in reaching the islands and reuniting with their families. She began to feel a profound sadness when the phantom ferry appeared, understanding that she was witnessing not just a ghost ship, but a tragedy that replayed itself endlessly. A moment of desperate hope, frozen in time and doomed to eternal repetition. On Beatrice's final night working for the ferry system before her retirement in 2003, the phantom Kalakala appeared one last time. The fog was particularly thick that evening, and Beatrice was making her last run from Friday Harbor to Lopez Island. Captain McKinnon's voice came through the radio with its familiar request for permission to dock. Beatrice granted clearance, as she always did. But this time she added something to her transmission. She thanked Captain McKinnon for his service, for his dedication to bringing people home safely, for his refusal to abandon his passengers, even in death. She told him that she understood his burden, that she honored his commitment, and that she hoped he would someday find the peace that had eluded him for more than 50 years. There was a long pause before Captain McKinnon responded. When his voice came through the radio again, it sounded different, quieter, almost peaceful. He thanked Beatrice for her kindness and her understanding. He said that perhaps it was time to stop trying, time to accept that some journeys cannot be completed, that some destinations remain forever out of reach. The phantom ferry passed Beatrice's vessel for the final time, and as it faded into the fog, Beatrice thought she saw the passengers waving goodbye, their faces no longer anxious but calm, as though they had finally accepted where they were and what they had become. Beatrice never saw the Kalakala again, and as far as she knows, neither has anyone else. The phantom ferry has not been reported in Puget Sound waters since that night in 2003. Perhaps Captain McKinnon finally found a way to release his passengers from their endless journey. Perhaps they all moved on to whatever lies beyond the fog and darkness that had held them for so long. Or perhaps they are still out there, sailing through dimensions that most people never see, waiting for the right conditions and the right witness to make themselves visible once more.